I'd now like to hand over to Dr. Olivier KRISCHER, who, apart from being an APT9 interlocutor, is Deputy Director of the China Studies Centre at the University of Sydney, having recently been a visiting fellow at the Institute for Modern History at Academia Sinica, Taiwan, and a postdoctoral fellow at the ANU in Canberra. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Ruben. Can people hear me? Yep, not really used to these. There was a great segue in from the last session, I thought, with Ishikawa-san sort of saying how important history was and that sense of agency. And for somebody who, as you just heard, I was in Taiwan last year in an Institute of Modern History, and art history is my field and so on, you would think that I would have worked out what history really constitutes. But as I think we'll hear, that's one of the sort of question marks. And it has, I think, a lot to do with some of the tensions that are certainly in the exhibition around practices. Do these constitute cultural traditions? Are they art? Are they contemporary or something else? And what does that mean? And history is one of those sorts of things as well. So I think that things will run more or less as they have, but I'd like to open up for some questions a little bit earlier in the session. So what I'll do first is just introduce each of our speakers in one second, but I wanted to just sort of connect a little bit more to what Carol was saying, because I think that there could be more connections between some of the talks that we've heard. The other thing that I also thought was interesting is that history is sort of the subject of this panel, and yet so many times in the other panels today I felt like, oh, that's what I thought I was talking about. And in a good way, in a really good way. So I hope that's apparent in some of the conversations as well, because I'm sure that there's some people on the panel who are wondering why they're here, who are wondering, am I an art historian? Like the questions that we were given, I think, were actually quite revealing of, the institution sort of showing what it feels its responsibilities and obligations and so on are in terms of canon making and the challenges to that. So I guess what I'm interested in is somebody who works both on the late 19th century, early 20th century in Japan and China in particular, and more recently in particularly the 1980s and 90s as both high points where art and culture were forms of exchange, perhaps alternative ways, prisms of looking at a China-Japan relationship, and particularly the sort of social aspect. I've always been more interested in the people there. So I'm interested, listening to Carol's talk. I knew a bit about the project. Unfortunately, I hadn't had an opportunity to see the exhibition. But what struck me about that was, again, this notion of moving the goalposts of time. So even something like that decade, which for those of you who aren't familiar, is a really different framework for thinking about the emergence of something that could be called Chinese contemporary art or contemporary Chinese art or something else. So I'm interested in that idea of looking more closely at histories, so perhaps getting away from the idea of schisms or fragmentations, crises, as being the sole ways that we might structure our understanding of the past. As well as narratives of the avant-garde. That's certainly something that's been very strong in the structuring of something like Chinese contemporary history as it has elsewhere. And I think that that's still important to the sorts of practices that we've heard about this morning. The idea then of looking at shared and composite histories, so points of commonality, and how what's hidden is often the connections that have brought us together. So this idea of trying to also get away from history being another way of compartmentalizing things, so that history becomes a sort of semantic border. And we saw, a map earlier in the day with, suddenly no borders. And I thought, that's also something that history does. It's a new understanding as well of existing sources, and that's something that we'll hear about in the panel, like working with materials that we might be familiar with. So definitely there's a lot of work that remains to be done. in pretty, cut and dry art historical or historical cultural work about revealing things. But often those things are in places that we may think we know quite well. And we'll hear a little bit more about that, I think. Something that came up, my question here is, who are the historians? So I'm quite aware of my role, and I feel, I often feel conflicted, I guess, when you're asked to talk about a context which is not my personal story necessarily, although in many ways it has become that. And at the book launch on the weekend, there was a great, much more articulate speaker than myself, Dr. Irene Tofurkey, who was talking about her work on co-authoring a book called Sinuous Objects, which I make the point because it has nothing to do in many ways with what I'm supposed to be, a researcher in, and yet she was talking very eloquently about her role as a scribe. So she was trying to position herself in relationship to a history that she's been actively involved in recording, and that, for me, I thought, the role of the scribe is something that we don't really talk about, which might seem bad because you're sort of shifting agency, but that's, I think, something that we might think of, because that raises also the issue of custodianship, which obviously, people know that that's what curators originally were. They were custodians, and that's what museums were. And maybe we can think about those ideas as well. That I think also linked to a longer sense of time. So I'm aware that I've taken up a little bit too much time. But lastly, just how do practices, so we've heard a lot about different things, but the questions that we were given were really about history making in, I thought, a pretty straightforward way. And yet I felt like there's been some discussion about definitions as well. And I think that definitions can also be a way of putting up borders between different things. And sometimes practices are a way of eclipsing those or surmounting those, and we find commonality. And you see that as well with artists and shared space of artists, where I often wonder, are any of these questions around history going to matter at all to artists' practices? Often they don't. And they seem to find, artists find their own ways through that history and their own relationships in a very unproblematic way, which maybe we can also take on board. So, all of that to foreground, the much more expert knowledge that's here with me today. I'm going to start here with Matt Pohl, who I didn't know, but we're in the same institution, University of Sydney. So it's a great sort of a great way of showing how APT does sort of bring people from near and far together. It's pretty classic. So Matt's the curator of Indigenous history and the Repatriation project at the Macleay Museum that's going to become part of a new museum at the university called the Chowtak Wing Museum. And he has over 2 decades of experience in museums. He also does research on the ways that contemporary Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders artists have used museum collections. And historic records as well as archival materials to reconstruct cultural identity, and that's something that I hope that we can talk about. Next to Matt is RATNA, another new friend. RATNA MUFIDA is here from Indonesia. She's based in Jogja, where she's been very involved in the Jogja Biennale, in Art Jog, in the Jogja Arts Festival. She's one of the co-founders of something called Hyphen, which I'm going to ask you about. That's just a heads up, which I think I'll just introduce as a kind of conversation, a sort of ongoing conversation and project to sew together fragments of Indonesian art history. Next to RATNA is DEIDRE, who's here. Dr. DEIDRE Brown's here. She's a professor and I think head of school of architecture at the University of Auckland. where her teaching and research are in the fields of Maori and Pacific architecture and art history. She's written a number of books as well as having curated projects on these subjects, and also has a very personal sort of tie to these, a very personal experience of some of the issues that I hope that we can talk about today. And certainly, last but not least, REEM, who's sort of hiding in her orange cardigan on the end because it's so cold in here. So REEM SHADID is here. She's a Palestinian curator who's based in the UAE, where she's currently a deputy director at the Sharjah Art Foundation. And among many other things, she organises the March Project, which is an annual educational residency program. And this year she was also the curator of the March meeting in Sharjah, and hopefully we can ask you a little bit more about that. So what I've discussed with the panel is for them to say a little bit more as a sort of self-introduction, a little bit more about what they do in better words than mine, and then we can get into some more questions. But a little bit different to the earlier panels, and hopefully time allows, I would like to not just leave questions for the last 10 minutes. I think there's people with really interesting expertise here and with a lot of experience in APT, as well as the various contexts that are represented here, and I'd like to sort of open up to that much earlier and maybe come back to panel and sort of bounce a bit back and forth, if that's okay. So, sorry to put you on the spot.
Me first?
Yeah, go for it, Matt.
Okay. So firstly, thank you to the organisers for inviting me. It's been a really interesting couple of years for me working as the curator and designing a consultation strategy for the new Chowchak Wing Museum, which opens in 2020. It's a huge historical shift, actually. You know, the Macleay Museum is named after Alexander Macleay, who was the colonial secretary. He was on the board of trustees who set up the Australian Museum. So this is actually his private collection, which is the foundational collection of our museum, as well as the University of Sydney Anthropology Department, and its role in constructing a version of Aboriginality and Torres Strait Islander identity in the 19th and 20th century, which is actually hugely problematic on a lot of levels for the contemporary community. So it's actually a little bit reassuring to see the APT and to see artists and the ways that some of the conversations that are going on are developing, because the new museum's due to open in 2020, which is the 250th anniversary of Cook's Landing in Sydney too, as well as Brooke Andrew, one of the first Aboriginal artistic director of the Biennale happening. So there's some great conversations sparking from all different parts of the country, I think, but I think once again that locus will be at Sydney and sort of really unpacking that history of the very foundational narrative of Australia. And the complex unpacking that all that involves.
That's a big responsibility, which I'll ask you about in a second. RATNA, tell.
Yeah, thank you for having me this afternoon. Yeah, as Oliver already mentioned, I'm part of a group called Hyphen. It's actually just a close group discussion between me and my friends Petra and Grace. And yeah, we initiated that group because of our curiosity toward the Indonesian art history. Yeah, even maybe we initiated and we're starting with the question, what is Indonesian art history, or what is art history itself? Because in our experience as an art practitioner in Indonesia, and the three of us based in Yogyakarta, we never, at that time, we never read or saw about the, what we imagine as a complete history, something like that. What we hear is Indonesia still is too young. Yeah. I mean, the history about Indonesian art from 1945 until 60s, and after that, between 1960 until 2000 era, we heard a lot. We heard a lot from our senior artist, our senior practitioner, but as a storytelling that they taught us again and again. And what struck me at that time is the story about Indonesian New Art movement with their seminal exhibition in 1975. They thought that it's influenced contemporary art, Indonesian contemporary art, etc. And then, we follow our curiosity and start digging up some material, something like that. And then we realized that we see that Indonesian art, the story about Indonesian art is still very fragmented. That's why we call it to show it bit by bit by collecting material or whatsoever, and then we share that material and invite several people to write essay or article, and maybe we can, and this kind of thing can end up in the publishing project. So we collect, for the first publishing, we collect like the collected essay by Edin Supriyanto, one of Indonesian curator, I think, after Jim Supangkat era, and then after that this Gerakan Seni Rupa Baru, Indonesian New Art Movement, and then right now we just unpack another artist studio, Mr. Edi Sunarso, who built some of landscape monument in Jakarta. Yeah, that's kind of thing that we did. So actually, if we're talking, let's see later. I mean, I'm very nervous about art history right now.
Me too. Deirdre?
Ko mātātua te waka, ko Ngāpuhi te iwi, ko Ngāti KAHU te hapu, ko Mangaiti te marae, ko Deirdre Brown Takuingwa. Kia ora koutou. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou. Thank you very much for having me here today. Thank you for the gallery for bringing me out here. I feel very privileged. I've had a number of wonderful days here just to see this wonderful work and to meet new people, especially these people sitting up here. So I started by reciting my whakapapa, which is my genealogy, which locates me within my tribal district, which is within Northland, and locates me within my work as well as a Maori art historian. And that puts me in the centre of things, and sometimes those things are fun things to be doing. Sometimes it puts you into the centre of a whole lot of arguments that you can't get out of. But what I'm working on at the moment is a new history of Maori art with my colleague, Dr. Ngarino Alice, also from the University of Auckland, and that history is called Toi Te Mana. And we began that project with another esteemed colleague, Professor Jonathan Manewhioki, who's known to many of you here and from former APTs, who sadly passed away a year into the project. So we're about 6 years in, and we're just wrapping that up at the moment. And the sorts of things that we've been having to, I wouldn't say overcome, but sort of challenges that we've faced with writing a new art history for Māori are things that have been shared already today. This issue when you come from a cyclical time culture and you enter into art history, which is very much a linear chronological discipline, how do you capture that, particularly if you're writing it in a book? How do you think about what drives the way that you reconsider time? Is it values-based? Is it based on descent levels? How do you do that? And particularly with the contemporary period, which we're talking about in this session here, Carol talked about, not wanting to see the contemporary period as a rupture in some sense, but actually joining it into a continuous narrative. And so for us, for Māori, this period of contemporary Māori art begins with modernism in the 1950s and 1960s. And here you see a group of Māori artists emerging out of art schools, coming through in the beginning of the 1950s, but kind of straddling two great art traditions, but not being fully accepted really into either one of them until recent times. So there is this disjunction in a sense, but what we found is that through the whole period of Māori art history, from Polynesian beginnings up to the present day, Māori have undergone disjuncture and claims and challenges, but they've been our claims and challenges, not necessarily those presented to us from the West. So those are the sorts of things that we've been dealing with our project.
Thank you. I'm going to come back to that book in a second, actually. Reem.
Thank you for everyone. It was really nice to speak yesterday, actually, because I realized that there are, like you said, a lot of commonalities with this particular kind of field of art history and defining it and when it starts and when it is acknowledged also. So for me, yesterday's conversation was already important, and then, continuing on today. Sharjah, the United Arab Emirates, my context is Sharjah, of course, but the United Arab Emirates is a young country. It was established in 1971, so it's 47 years old. Almost in a couple of days, it will be 47 years old. So there hasn't been much scholarship, I would say, on art history in the UAE. It came maybe 12 years ago only, so it's been a while. In the beginning, the artists who were practicing were seen kind of as troublemakers and were not incorporated into kind of the national history or like making of that history. And it was only 12 years ago or so that this was kind of started being taken in as a national history that the country also wanted to take on. So like RATNA also was saying, so like this talk about art history is very new in the UAE. And what's also interesting is that while, of course, the country was established in 1971, but people have been living there forever. Not to say that there is no traditional heritage or handcrafts or arts crafts or, yeah. So that has been around, but for some reason that is also not brought into the art history conversation. So what we work on at Sharjah Art Foundation, and while it's not an official mission of ours, is to work on these histories in different ways and through working very closely with on research, but also with communities in the UAE, through exhibitions, publications, but also through actually architecturally also preserving some of the old buildings or asking, to take care of them and repurposing them into making them into art spaces. So this I think is a very important part of our work that we generally don't necessarily talk about because we're just kind of in the making, working with different artists from the 1980s who were kind of the marker of the beginning of art history in the UAE, but also looking at different practices that were happening. So this is kind of in brief where we are specifically with Sharjah. Yeah.
It's interesting when we were talking about, we had a conversation earlier to try and sort of get to know each other a little bit, and in that, one of the things that struck me was this notion of, having young nations and this sense of people feeling like they're catching up, or if they're trying to write history around that, and yet so often that history is just as uncertain in contexts as we sort of saw in Carol's talk, a context like China that you think's probably got more than enough history to have worked out what happened in the past. But in another sense, not at all. That all of that is contentious, pretty much, even just the nomenclature around that, as well as just the resonance sometimes with the situation that RATNA, you were describing with the 1970s. One of the things that interests me, I guess, is a little bit about where those, like how we interact with those histories. So in the case, Reem, you were just talking about how this comes very much through practice, and then you're trying to sort of piece together these pieces, which is similar to something that you're doing right now. Can you talk a little bit about how you started to look for that history? Obviously, there's people who have written things, but I'm interested in the idea that we also sort of touched on, which has come up earlier, as history as a kind of lived story, and it made me think. In my own background is French speaking, and I love the fact that histoire kind of works. There's no two words. It's the same word for story and history. And I was thinking, as we were listening to this discussion, that in some ways, history is kind of like a story with agency. You've kind of got different rights there. So could you tell us a little bit about how you've gone about, probing that curiosity and some of the maybe challenges as well as the sort of, you know, the positives in finding a way to work, to finding your way towards this sort of Indonesian art history?
Yeah, as I said earlier, it's actually maybe it simply started by curiosity, because it's our generation art practitioner. It seemed like we are, detached or not related closely with the story that we hear. I mean, what our practice in what we saw in our daily practice it seemed like that it's so far away, and of course at that time it's because of we also struck with when we find some we read some old article etc. That's very impressed us. I mean, we found that the same question actually already asked by our senior practitioner, senior artist, or senior writer, or senior critic. At that time there is no curator yet, and until nowadays we still ask the same question, something like that. And how come we imagine that if we have this kind of if we can access that kind of thought before, and everybody can access it, maybe we already maybe we can do I don't know, better or more instead of just walking in the same level or same situation. Yeah, I think it's start with that kind of situation that drive us to start to collecting this material, and then we collect everything what we can, some mass media clipping. We interview again the senior artists that from 1970 era that still alive. Some of them still active in the art scene, Indonesian art scene, and some of them already retired. But yeah, we just come to their home, something like that. And yeah, after we collect this material, we invite several writer or researcher to try to interpret again our materials.
It's interesting. Sorry to cut you off there, but it's interesting because immediately you get this idea of agency and people interpreting something from the contemporary. So that idea of history always being sort of remade, and that gets that makes me think of DEIDRE. You were talking about different sort of structures and cyclical sort of time. Can you actually talk a little bit about the book that you're writing in the framework that you described?
So how we've had to deal with time. So with Māori time, the idea is Māori time's very complex. So there's no sense of a past, present, or future. Everything's just moving around, and everything can be interpreted according to any of those paradigms. So the structure that we ended up going with in the end was to look at the three baskets of Māori knowledge and to consider our work as in three different parts. So it's a very values-based driven model. Other historians have used other models as well. So, for example, Rangihiro Panaho, in his recent book on Maori art, has taken his idea of him being a contemporary person and looking at arts from before him and interpreting them in that sort of way. Ours is slightly different, and so while it might appear to be a little bit like a chronology, it isn't quite. So we have a customary section which exists in both past, present, and future. So looking at that work as a continuity, because so often, and particularly when anthropologists move into the field of art history, they'll say this is the traditional period. and this is the in-between period, and this is the contemporary period. Not, forgetting that there's customary art going all the way through, and it will go on to do so for a long time. Then we deal with the basket of knowledge, which is, I guess, to do with disruption and how we've characterised that as we've looked at the 19th century, and we've looked particularly at the Anglo-Maori Wars, but also the arrival of new materials and technologies, which both reinvigorated and challenged Maori culture. And as we move into the 20th century, have left a series of questions and challenges and problems that we've been trying to pick up on. And then when we move to the third basket of knowledge, we talk about trying to overcome those challenges. So particularly when writing an art history and talking to the artists, you get the strong sense of the influence of the Māori civil rights movement in the development of a Māori art history. And so it's out of that in the 70s and 80s that you get figures like Jonathan Mani-Whioki, but also Ngahui Atawa Kotuku getting appointed to universities as the treaty sesquicentennial approaches in 1990, and kind of thinking, well, what is a Māori art history? And the struggles have been about how have Māori, particularly who want to engage with contemporary traditions of art from the Western world, the struggle that they've got to be admitted to universities, the struggle that they've had to be taken seriously, the struggle to be recognised through having their work exhibited or collected or written into art histories. And so some of the outcomes that we found in this third basket of knowledge have been that often the work was collected by municipal art galleries. So, for example, Auckland Art Gallery purchased in 1948 the first contemporary Māori artwork for its collection. I'm pointing at Chris Sains here because he used to be the director of that institution. Selwyn Wilson, Study of a Head, yet that work was not exhibited for some time. So the work's been collected, and this first group of Māori artists emerging in the 50s and 60s have their work exhibited in public libraries and museums. It's a long time before they enter the art gallery situation. So there's a sense through the Māori civil rights movement, which is dealing with the struggle to hold on to the language, but also the struggle to be educated and the struggle to exhibit art as well and to be written about. So those are the sorts of ways that we've structured this particular narrative. There would be other ways too. We're not saying that this is the best way, but it's the way that we found most useful in moving forward.
Thanks. Yeah. I'm actually going to ask Matt. Sorry. Just that issue of universities or institutions like municipal galleries and so on being the homes of so much material sort of culture, past and present. And I'm wondering, in your role, like how does that role correspond or not to what your experience has sort of taught you over the last couple of decades? As obviously these sorts of understandings and what people sort of acknowledge and all of that has also shifted along the way.
University museums, I think, are quite different to state institutions, I guess. So there is a bit more leeway, and you do have a lot more access to historians, scientists, all sorts of fields to really expand the story that you deal with communities. In relation to the current collections that we're working with, I mean, we're just trying to work with the whole collection as a consultation tool. In the new museum project, there will be no separate gallery of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australia, for example. All the permanent display cases will be in conversation with other world dialogue, world cultures. At the moment, it's mostly classical antiquities because we're merging with the Nicholson Museum, so there's a lot of Greek, Roman and Italian stuff there. But it will be quite fantastic to put Baru crocodile ancestor stories from Yolnu country in proximity to ancient Egyptian depictions of ancestral crocodile figures and things like that. So I guess for us, it's trying to put things contingent with each other without forcing it too much is the real challenge. And just trying to reconfigure not just the histories but the spaces themselves so that they actually set it up differently. The main thing is to really let the communities design the exhibition spaces and to embed their perspectives in it. I mean, as a curator, that sounds really lazy, but it's not actually. It's 10 times more work. which I found the hard way.
That's interesting, these sorts of contentions, which I think Deidre also mentioned. Sometimes you kind of open up these cans of worms, perhaps. But in your case, Reem, you mentioned, that in some senses it's a relatively short history, but as soon as you start to scratch the surface and go back, you start to find that actually the histories of the community you thought you were sort of looking at are actually all much more fluid and trans-border and so on. And so you actually find yourself kind of representing stuff. Do you want to talk a bit from your experience of that type of, as an institution, discovering the breadth of...
Yes. To be honest, we normally discover it through working with artists who are interested in certain topics. So they come and, from wherever, even from the UAE, and, they say we're interested in, this particular, figure, or this particular kind of basket, and then we start looking into it, we start researching with the artist, and now it's about to be the 14th biennial in March. So we have all this research that actually is just sitting there from working very closely with artists on their artistic practices. And it's not that the artist necessarily ends up doing a historical project about this, but it kind of comes in somehow in their commission or site-specific installation or whatever. So for us, it really comes through practice, with artists. Or sometimes it also comes from our education community outreach programs. So, for example, there are our community outreach programs do a lot of fun workshops and courses in our neighborhood. So, for example, some of them, we have something like making ice cream, but what they do is that they go to the souk and they see what spices are there. We have a spice market behind our spaces. And then it starts a conversation about the history and, for example, how these specific things came to the UAE and what they're used for. So it's not, of course, artists also use it, but it's also like this. We feel this responsibility to kind of expand beyond just kind of artistic work, and we do it through the community of trying to dig into these kind of histories that are there that we might not necessarily find it in books or in, I guess in books mostly, or in films maybe. Yeah. So this is how we're kind of working with that.
Is that something that resonates, sorry, Matt, with the sorts of projects that you have in mind, or that your own research has been looking at with artists working with collections?
Definitely. From RATNA's and your self-talk as well. It's very contemporaneous with the contemporary Aboriginal art movement. 1971 was Papunya Tula, the Bali Aboriginal Arts Cooperative, even proper now here in Brisbane. Those cooperatives are very similar. And a lot of those artists were scouring museum collections and archives and any fragment of media sometimes for anything that they could use to learn the history that they'd been displaced from. So there's some great parallels there, I think, not just in the same time periods, but the way that artists are real trailblazers in that way of sort of being, experimental historians in a sense, and actually writing new histories because the old ones don't work. And we find it a lot. Some of these old anthropological histories that when they get out there in the community, if they're not properly contextualised, they can cause a lot of divisions. Sometimes there genuinely is sacred things in them and stuff that they shouldn't be out there. But, a lot of new people may find something on the internet that can, really is empowering for them, but is also quite jarring to an older generation of people who were taught something very different about that same information. So, it's a constant negotiation, as you were saying, because, when you're working, in my case, for an institution which has this huge colonial baggage and legacy attached to it too, you can't do anything that privileges that institution over a very disadvantaged community.
Yeah.
For us, it's also, I think Ratna was talking about this, there's also this element of oral history, because again, with the UAE being a new nation, there's a lot of the history that actually is just with the old generation that has never, and I'm sure actually this is with all of our context. I just wanted to add that.
Yeah. And how do you incorporate that? That's kind of a question as well. Like, how do you sort of get that not only simply as sort of material, but how do you have that process within a new or different framework for how we're constructing history? Is that something that you think about? I'd say to both Deidre and Ratna, like, in slightly different contexts, but still you're sort of working on histories which present themselves as reasonably canonical or as full, Indonesian art history. How do you incorporate something like oral history or, different voices in that?
How do we incorporate it? I don't know. I think we... this kind of canon historical, actually, maybe we didn't find it yet also in Indonesia. Even maybe this Indonesian New Art movement is part of this canon story about Indonesian contemporary art story in India. But the way this canon was built, I don't know, maybe it's not what the common canon was built, but it's more like a myth for us, for our generation. I mean, that's why we try to see deeper about this myth. And then, of course, in our process, while we try to digging up again this material, we find which one is myth and which one is not. And yeah, while for us, what is more important is what can we do, or what can we bring this thing to our nowadays practice context. I mean, something like that. So, like I told you yesterday, I mean, we found that there is certain thing that there's still maybe there is similar situation or a similar problem that we have to deal with on what can we learn from the story from the past. I mean, what kind of position we can take, and then within today's context, something like that.
Did you want to say something about that?
It's a really tricky question, eh? This how do you deal with a canonical history? And then you have, and you've had this experience too from what you've just said in the discussion that we had yesterday, where you have the oral histories not matching them. So the way that it's been generally dealt with in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and I'm talking generally here, we follow the line that Linda Smith wrote in Decolonising Methodologies, which is published in 1999. It's a very important book for Indigenous scholars, and that you've just got to put the two next to each other. So they both have their own, the oral voice is an authentic voice, and then you put the canon next to it. And they may not be in conversation with each other, they might be in opposition, but they're both there for people to see.
It's interesting because it makes me think that those sorts of juxtapositions also have to kind of happen in a third space, which makes me think about the APT.